Welcome to From Clinical to Entrepreneurial, OT Private Practice Journeys, an Ontario Society of Occupational Therapists podcast. In this series, we connect with occupational therapists, private practitioners, and business owners, and we hear about their inspiration, their stories, and their lessons learned. I'm Seema Sindwani, OSOT's Director of Strategic Partnerships and Practice. In this episode, we conclude our conversation with Sharie Woelke, an OT, registered psychotherapist, clinician educator, and learning designer. We really get below the surface to understand her business operations, money mindset, and how important it is to stop, look, and listen. Let's dive into the details. We are joined again by the lovely Sharie Woelke, who was our guest on episode 1, is our guest today, and then will become my fabulous co-host. So really excited about that transition too.
Me too. That'll be great.
We covered a lot of ground in our first episode, Sharie, and I hope, I've been interacting with you for quite some time now, but I really hope that first episode gave our listeners a chance to get to know you and got a little bit of insight into who you are as a person and a professional. So episode 1 was really just getting to know you and, sort of some of your motivation around becoming a business owner, and accidental as it was.
Accidental.
Accidental as it was. And so you taking us on that journey, which I know it's not over, it's an ongoing journey. And so for today's episode, I think we'll shift a little bit to maybe getting down into some more kind of core business details. So
Yeah.
I'm not going to say rapid fire necessarily, but maybe a few more kind of poignant questions that'll really help our listeners get underneath the hood of the car and understand sort of how things are working. So where we left off, we talked about how there's so many things to balance, the client-facing pieces, the operational pieces, and the regulatory pieces.
Yes.
So maybe you can let our listeners know how you stay abreast or on top of all of the legal and regulatory requirements of your business.
Absolutely. So first of all, of course, CODO and CRPO have great websites, and they have really huge documents that cover pretty much everything we need to know. Some of them, there are checklists. CRPO, for example, has a marketing checklist document where you have to have certain things on the invoice and the receipts that you provide clients and so on. So that's really helpful. What I've done over the years is I've taken all of them, even the ones that aren't in a checklist format, and I've converted them to checklist formats for myself.
Okay.
And then sorry, I saw the expression on your face.
It's amazing. Well, I think
yes, I'm obsessive.
No, I think it's wonderful.
So then what I do is a couple times a year, it depends a little bit, 2 to 4 times a year, usually when I'm going through either CRPO or CODO's self checklists and so on.
Like our self-assessment or
exactly.
Yep.
So that's when I run through all of that and I try to make sure we're up to date on everything. And then I compare that. You remember last week we talked about how I wrote a big policy and procedure and an SOP website. So I try to compare that to the SOP website and I do my updates at that time. So we've kind of got things into a bit of a flow right now, but there's always something to tweak and to change. And then if I do identify anything that we really need to work on as a team, I'll start, annoying the team and sending them an email, and I'll sort of write up a new, I guess, SOP or policy or something that I add to that website. So we have that. So that's the best way to ensure the compliance from our perspective, because we're kind of spread across Eastern Ontario and we want to make sure that we're up to date on things.
Okay, that's really helpful. And, certainly you're aware, and we at OSOT get a lot of questions around privacy, confidentiality, data management. So anything from you around how you ensure compliance with data management?
Yeah, so of course we know what's necessary based on the requirements from our regulatory bodies and the legal requirements. So you kind of take a look at those things. We are fortunate because we're in a position where we're large enough to be able to afford clinic management software. And our decision making then about clinic management software is largely based on, is this secure platform consistent with requirements? So if it is, we're good to go. We can use it. And that solves a whole bunch of issues. So we used to use, until recently, Owl Practice Management, which was really great. It had a lot of features that we needed, but to be perfectly blunt, they do not have a good online booking platform compared to some of the other options. So we ended up making a switch to Jane, which is also a great tool for a couple other features. One thing, and I'll just give this little cue to anybody who's sort of at that stage of medium growth. One problem that we find is not all the clinic management platforms have a secure internal chat. Owl did, and that's why we went with it. And also because it was before the pandemic and it was a great software that matched our needs at that time. But that secure internal chat can go back and forth between therapists. So if you are sending reports back and forth for editing or proofing, if you have client questions, if there's a new referral and you want to send it out and see who needs it, that was wonderful. Now, that's set up differently in Jane, and we're working our way through it. We're just sending tasks back and forth, but we do miss that component. There's something wonderful about just being able to like write something to your coworkers and not have to worry. So I think that's a really interesting piece for people to consider when they're deciding how they're going to move forward with their communications with the team members.
Okay. Any other challenges? I mean, you've commented on sort of differentiating between the software, but any other challenges you feel you've faced trying to balance, I'll say, business pieces, regulatory pieces, maybe even ethical pieces? Just any comments from you around that very difficult balancing act?
I think one of the things that we run into, and I think most other providers would say this is the big one, is session notes and report writing. That's a big one because our obligations according to the college are one thing. We have to have certain things documented in a certain way. However, then we have that challenge where an insurer or a referral source is only able to cover the cost of a certain amount of time. So there's always that balance of trying to make sure we have everything that we need from a regulatory perspective while fitting that into the timeline that the referral source is able to cover the cost for. So that's always a big one. That takes fiddling. A lot of the session note templates in the clinic management software now are set up so that it's much, there are a lot of efficiencies that they promote now, which is really great. There's lots of tools. And I think one of those keys is trying to remember to use the technology that you end up going with to the full extent it's available, because there's a lot of times you might pay for a clinic management software or pays for some sort of a tool, but you're only using like 25% of what it offers.
Right.
And that's a learning curve for a lot of people, because a lot of people want to have their whole session with the client and then they want to take a half hour and write their session note after.
Right.
As opposed to taking notes as you go,
Right.
and then using that as your resource and so on. So, and a lot of like newer therapists are educated to do things that way as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and just it comes with experience. You know, you're with a client, you write it as you go, you formulate the plan while you're with them, you write them their to-do list for the week, and that's that. So that is a problem. That is a problem to merge all those pieces together.
And you've talked about ways to create efficiency, and you've mentioned templates. So do you have templates for everything, Sharie? You've got reports, you have consent forms. Where do they live?
Yes. So we have report templates, we have consent forms, we have session note templates, we have automatic questionnaires that are sent to the clients. So that also really helps. So we have a lot within our clinic management software. So they are sent, the consent forms and the questionnaires, the moment they're booked, or the therapist can send it to them directly and the client can sign it. So that's all done within that secure online platform. So we also have, PDF versions that they can use. So in our practice, we have a Google Drive, And in that Google Drive, we have a ton of educational resources, therapy resources, consent forms, report templates, and so on. That Google Drive, sorry for the boring technical stuff, is linked to our Google site, which is the policy and procedure, and the SOP. So if you go onto the policy and procedure website and you go into our documentation SOP, it gives you all the different steps for documentation. So for a psychotherapy initial, here's your report. This is how you submit it. If it's this insurer, you follow these steps to submit it. If it's this insurer, you follow these steps to submit it. So that's all there. And then it's hyperlinked to the report templates, to the associated report templates that are in the Google Drive. So that's where everything is kind of stored from a technology perspective. So Google Drive has it all. They can go search that way, or they go to the site and it's all linked up to Google Drive. So there's no client information in Google Drive. That's just templates and educational resources, workbooks, courses, that kind of stuff. Client information is in the clinic management software.
So it sounds like there are a lot of moving parts, but a lot of pieces in place that kind of fit together like a puzzle. And I'm just thinking about each sort of individual listener we have, Sharie, and thinking about that person who's maybe just starting out or has just been kind of in private practice for a little bit of time. I'm looking for more of the advice here. Can you share with us, what are the first few templates that they should have in their toolkit? What are the first few policies and procedures they should write, and how are they writing these? Can you help us with a little bit of the just getting going and building that momentum?
Yeah, absolutely. So you would want a consent to treatment, of course, or consent to assessment or treatment. Important, consent to communicate. So you need those two to proceed, and you can pull the wording off of that largely from the CODA website. So you can almost take paragraphs from their manuals.
Standards of practice.
Thank you.
You're
I've been
welcome.
thinking about that word for a while. Like, what is that word?
I
You
used to
can
work at the
almost
college,
pull
so I
it.
should probably have that sort of verbatim.
Thank you, Seema.
No problem.
Yeah, so you can pull that. So that's super helpful.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you need your initial report template, your progress report template, and your discharge. And that is going to be kind of what you need to include is kind of going to be dependent based on who you're writing the report for.
Right.
So if possible, you want to have sort of one somewhat flexible overall report template that you use. So we kind of have like the original couple of pages, client overview. We have those different sections. We have the goal, we have the analysis, so SOAP-ish kind of a format. And thinking of your reports, just I'll interject this here. The report is to justify your recommendations and your intervention. The person reading your report, just remember, they're not another therapist necessarily. Frequently, they're not. Frequently, they might not even be a healthcare provider. So just whatever you do in your report when you are developing the template, you want to write it so that, someone picking it up will read through it and be like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, that's the point. That's what you're trying to do with your report. So simple, efficient, make it clear.
And that's really helpful. Thank you. And what about the other half of the question around the policies? What were the first few you started with, and how did you write them?
Ooh, the first few I started with. That's a hard question to answer. I'm trying to think back to my earlier. So essentially what you want to do is anytime you're doing something that you repeat over and over again,
Excellent.
that's what you want to write down.
Okay.
Now, if you're me, what you do is you dictate it as you're doing it. You will see that I like my technology and I like my AI. But usually what I'll do is I'll use a Google form. I'm sorry, not a Google form. I'll use a Google Doc, and I usually do it on my phone because you can just hit the little mic and you just talk your way through it. You just say what you do. Then you go over to ChatGPT and you paste in that transcription and you say, create this as an SOP. And then it will create it as a step-by-step SOP for you. And then you put that wherever you're going to store your policy and procedures or your SOPs. And by SOP, I mean standard operating procedures. And then it is replicatable. So that tends to be how I got started with doing those things, but I'm not remembering the exact first ones that I did.
No, that fair. And my rationale for asking is really we're speaking to you at this point where you've got so many things in place. And
Yes,
so,
exactly.
I just reminding our listener that it took you time to get here and that this fabulous website of
Yes.
policy and procedures that you have didn't happen overnight and that it took time.
No,
And
and I
and
think
didn't
I
happen when you had AI kind of as a resource at your fingertips either. So people
no.
now, right, kind of have certain technologies to
Yes.
support them in a way that you wouldn't have when you started it.
It's true, and it's fast when you're using AI.
Yeah.
And I think if you want, you can channel me as you're going through this process, right? Because I had to do this because I was in a point where I couldn't tell anyone anymore. So if
Right.
you can't tell anyone, how do you convey that information?
Right.
So that's where that came from. So just imagine you're in a position where you are trying to expand and you are trying to have another therapist join your practice, or there's something that you're not doing that often and you want to remember how to do it, like all of those kinds of things. That's what you want to throw into your policy and your procedure or your SOP, or information that you repeatedly have to go to. Like we
Right.
have a whole section that's all like standards, regulations, and so on. And that's all linked throughout the SOPs and, the Google Drive and so on, so that hopefully the link is there when you need it.
And do you have an intake process or form related to that?
So we actually have quite a few different avenues for intake.
Okay.
So if somebody calls us, they will link up with our intake coordinator and she will walk them through, what are you looking for, and sort of talk through the different therapists, because every therapist has, a great skill set, and they're all unique. So she will talk through people that way, and help direct them. And then she will connect with the therapists and just confirm availability and so on. So, oh, we've got a lot of different pieces here. So she also has a document where therapists, because a lot of them are independent contractors, and they will indicate how many or how many client spaces they have available. So she has a spreadsheet she refers to, she knows what people are taking and so on. So that's by phone call. By email, it also comes in and it makes its way to our intake coordinator as well. If you are doing online booking, you can also book directly with the therapist. As soon as you book with the therapist, it sets you up to set an account up, and then it will send the clients an intake form for them to fill in. And they can also connect with our intake coordinator by setting up an appointment with her online. And then she will meet with them and have that appointment-based consultation to get them up and running.
And
So
is your
they're
scheduling and booking of client sessions process or technology different from your clinic management software?
It's embedded.
It's
Yeah.
embedded. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that makes it really nice because then that part becomes automated,
Right.
where a client books it, consent and intake form are immediately sent to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, on this same topic of kind of forms and templates and
Yeah.
processes, can you tell us about your invoicing and payment collection process? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about fees after that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So with this new clinic management software, that for private clients is actually included. So within the software, the invoice is sent out at the end of the day. If a client comes and the therapist clicks to confirm attendance, then that invoice is sent out at the end of the day, and people can pay us. Usually it's by credit card, which we have on file. They approve it, and so on. For individual referral sources that are not private clients, it gets a little bit more confusing because, as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of different platforms and portals. So like WSIB versus, Blue Cross versus Auto. Another confounding factor we sometimes have is that Auto will approve frequently now a portion of the therapist fee, but not the whole thing.
So we've talked about processes related to invoicing. Let's talk about we'll start with fees.
Mhm.
How did you determine what to charge clients?
This has been a problem for me because, as you know from our last conversation, I have a very bad money attitude that I'm working on
Money
overcoming.
mindset. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Um, However, what has been very helpful is going through our financial structure and realizing that there are minimums. What we can charge, given the fact that we've got operational expenses, administration expenses, and how much the therapists are paid per hour. So you get to a point where you're just kind of like, there's just no wiggle room. We got to do this. So we look at industry averages. So OT is usually at this point in time, I think there's still one company that I know of that's doing 110, but most are sort of 110 to 150 an hour. That tends to be what you see. And then you can look at what the individual referral sources are also paying. So you can have, I believe, Blue Cross's compensation is now something like 140. I may be a little bit off there, but I believe that for OT. So you kind of look at the industry standard, you look at what you're paying the therapist, you look at how much time it takes. And I say that because doing occupational therapy with an adult where you're getting paid, maybe you're in the clinic and they're coming in for an hour, that's pretty straightforward. Then if you're talking about traveling, we still need to pay the therapist the same amount of money. So that becomes an hourly rate that you have to consider. Now that's different if you're an occupational therapist who's seeing a pediatric client, because the pediatric client isn't just the child, it's the parents. So it's not a straight one-to-one. You might have a 1 hour session, but because you have to do the extra follow-up, the extra prep, the extra consultation with the client, you might need to pay your therapist for an hour and a half of time for that 1 hour of that 1 hour long invoice that you send. So you kind of have to look at how much time it's actually taking, the going hourly rates, and adapt all of that stuff. And then when it comes to psychotherapy, like we said, they're anywhere from 150 to 200. So what are you paying your psychotherapist? What market are you in? Because in Ottawa, there's a huge proportion of people who have access to Canada Life government funding, and they have $5,000 of psychotherapy coverage. In North Bay, people don't have that. So are people able to access the psychotherapy funding in the different regions? So those are considerations that you have to think about as well.
And your services are for adults and children? It's
Yeah,
okay. Okay.
yeah. Our
That's fine.
therapists kind of have, even though we have sort of our general approach, each therapist has areas of interest and expertise and so on. And we always tell the therapists that we want to support their unique skills to whatever extent we can. Sometimes, you try and you're like, dead air. There is apparently no market for the skill you offer at this point in time. Like, we're just not finding the audience.
Yeah.
But if it does move forward, then we want to support that because we want our therapists to enjoy their jobs.
Sure.
So,
Okay. And so that's helpful. I guess just to add to for our listeners on the OSAT website, we do publish annually. It's our membership report, and that
yes,
is a collation of member reported demographic
that's
information.
right.
So
Yeah.
it'll give our listeners a sense, like a snapshot annually of what our members are reporting they are charging for their services. And so
Yes.
it's a good place to get that information. And so I was going to ask you, Sharie, so you talked a little bit about your fee structure for what you charge pay your therapists. Now, how does that impact or translate into what you're charging your clients for the services?
Okay, so I'm sorry. I answered how we choose what we charge our
Oh, we want to
clients.
know both.
And
There's
now
no
we're going to
apology
the
required.
therapist.
We want to know both. And I imagine there are and I love the way you broke it down. There's so many considerations, seeing an adult client versus a pediatric client. And I love the way you articulated that. It was really thoughtful. And I imagine when you talk about what you charge your clients, there's considerations there too. Do they have insurance coverage?
Yes.
Do
So we
they
do have a sliding scale for sure.
Okay.
And going back to what we're paying our therapists,
Yeah.
that's being stressful, to be honest,
Yeah, agreed.
because you want to be able to give everyone everything.
Yeah.
But sometimes you don't know. So what I'll often do, first of all, we use OSAT's survey. We've
Oh,
used
good.
that
Okay.
regularly.
Yep.
I actually messaged CRPO a couple of years ago to find out if they have something similar, and they didn't at the time, but they were like, hey, how about if I just like send out a question on our listserv to see if anyone will answer? So that was really nice of them to
Hmm.
do.
Hmm.
So what we tend to do, because the OSAT member survey also breaks it down by region,
Yes.
which is helpful.
Right.
So we follow that. And then just because you're kind of always talking to people and you've sort of got, interviews and recruitment going on in the background, you're always trying to figure out what's industry norms. So
Yeah.
sometimes what'll happen is the therapists will message us and they'll be like, hey, I just talked to so and so, this is what they're getting. Or sometimes I'll go to the OSAT member survey because things past few years are moving so fast in terms of rate increases. Craziness. So sometimes you'll come to an agreement, with one psychotherapist or OT who starts 6 months ago, and then 6 months later, you're thinking that you're starting from the same perspective,
Right.
and the industry's changed. Now it's increased, or the rate is increased. So usually I'll ask people to like tell me, just give me the references, tell me where you're getting that from. Because sometimes the rates surprise me, either in that they're super low or super high. Sometimes I'm like, I don't understand how that's feasible. And then you find out, well, that company is only virtual. So they have their operating expenses are almost nothing. So maybe that's why they can cover more. But then you also realize, okay, but they're only offering you 4 clients, versus you are also looking at the hospital websites to find out how much
Sure.
they're charging
And we
and
know
so
there's a
on.
difference in terms of sector, in terms
Yeah,
of what OTs are being paid, and that's
yeah,
again big part of the OSAT advocacy piece there.
yes.
A few questions, and I want to
Yep,
drill down a little more deeply into financial metrics and managing cash flow. Nowhere have we talked about it. And how does Sharie get paid?
yeah.
Now, before we do that, if quick enough, one thing I'm just thinking about is HR pieces. Do you or how do you manage contracts with your therapists, or anything in that big bucket of HR? And maybe
Yeah.
that's a bigger conversation, but is there anything you can touch on in terms of contracts and managing that?
Yeah, and it's not actually a crazy huge conversation because we're a
Okay.
small company.
Right. Right.
So essentially, we have a great legal support,
Okay.
and they've set us up with contracts. Even that incentive program that I was just talking
Yep.
about, we come up with an idea, we like call in, what do we do?
Yep.
And
Yep.
he tells us, either who to talk to or he sets us up himself.
So now I'm going to flip us back to the
The
financial pieces.
financials.
You've commented on your money attitude and
Yep.
your money mindset, and I echoed, I think, in our first episode that this is not the first time I've heard this type of money attitude or mindset from occupational therapists in particular.
Yes.
Um, Maybe walk us through a little bit of any financial metrics you haven't already shared. So other things that you measure and monitor, and maybe how you're managing your cash flow. You've
Yep.
touched on it, but any other details you'd like to provide us about that?
Yes. So, two books. One is Profit First,
Okay.
and one is The Psychology of Money. So you remember from last episode when I talked about how we got to that huge billable to non-billable flip
Yeah.
at the same time as we got to the I can't see clients, how am I going to generate income,
Right.
at the same time as we had COVID and the voice and the explosion and the crash and burn. So coming out of that, a couple things happened. I got my injection that started working a little bit better. We realized that the industry changes we were expecting were not as impactful as we thought they were going to be.
Hmm.
And the COVID pandemic started to lift. So at that point in time, we were like, we're just going to try to figure this out. And I said, I think I'm going to try to be a grown up and figure out how to actually run a business like a real business person. And I started reading a lot of books. I knew money attitude was a problem of mine. When I read Psychology of Money, it was really helpful. And there was something that stuck with me that I always tell myself every time I have the urge to tell people, don't worry about it. We'll pay you whatever you want, and your clients don't have to pay us a thing. There's this quote in there where he says, Something about coming home and looking at your kids and thinking, did I do something today that could jeopardize your future? And that spoke to me because when we were going through all that, I was like, I just did like over $100,000 worth of things that could have jeopardized their future, right? So that was really impactful. So that's one thing I keep in my mind now. And I think that's helped me get through my natural socialistic instincts a little bit. I'm like, capitalism. No.
It is very impactful. I mean that's resonating for sure.
Right?
Yeah.
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 So that's helpful from an emotional perspective. Then what we did is we did the calculation, and this is where I'm coming to Profit First is another book, and it's super simplistic, but it's really helpful. And a lot of the book is spent saying, don't ignore it. Just look. You don't want to look, just look. You got to know, just look. So what he does and recommends is that and it's not realistic for us yet because of where things are in the balance, but you look at sort of your 100% of gross. And then what are you paying your therapists? What are your operating expenses? What's the admin? And then he recommends, because we're a professional corporation now, so owner compensation is another category. And then you have your business profits. That's your business's money. Owner compensation is your money that you can work with. But then the profit, the business profit. So the goal is the fantasy goal is 20% business profit. That's not happening. I want to get there someday. You asked the long-term goal. That's the long-term goal. And that will only come when we increase our billable hours enough that in proportion, the fixed expenses decrease. So from a owner compensation perspective, Kevin, my husband, who's also part of the practice, he does a lot of it. He's admin, management, and so on. He sees a few clients, but not that many. So he gets compensated to a large extent out of the admin bucket. I'm now able to, for the most part, cover my own expenses. I do assessment work instead of rehab work, and I actually subcontract to another company who does a lot of assessment work. So that sort of, I pay for myself, so to speak. So that's how we get paid. And then with that profit piece, this is another slightly confusing component that might be helpful for some people to consider when they're starting their own practice and considering the structure. As a as a professional corporation, as an occupational therapist, a non-occupational therapist can't also be a co-owner.
Okay.
And in different provinces in Canada, you can or cannot have an occupational therapist or have a non-occupational therapist be kind of a co-owner of the holding company, so to speak. So what would happen is you'd have that profit, and then you would put that into a holding company for investment and growth and so on. So if you're trying to work with a non-OT as a professional corporation, essentially, if something happens to me, like that's my company.
Right.
He doesn't have access to that stuff.
Right.
He does as like a signatory on the company because he manages that side of things.
But
so
in terms
what we
of the
would
actual profit,
that's it. So what we need to do is we have a sister company. So this is where you really want to make sure that you're talking to an accountant who knows kind of all the ins and outs of this thing, because then as a sister company, he can be a co-owner, but it can't be professional corporation holding company. So then the goal, right, is that 20%, which we don't have, but we will someday, goes into that sister company where it's invested.
Okay.
And with respect to one other question about like where we keep our money, we have 3 months of expenses and pay periods in our clinic account. So we have that amount of money for 3 months so that we're covered.
Your safety net.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how that's working for us right now.
So we want to learn from you further. So tell me, can you name sort of, one or two cost saving methods that you've implemented?
The biggest was the billable, non-billable hours.
Okay.
That's huge. We're also working on efficiencies, and that's part of what we're trying to do with the online booking. That's a little, it's pertinent for OT, but it's a little harder for OT when we're working in the community because booking an OT appointment online when the OT is traveling and you don't know how long the distance is going to be, so you don't know how long to book, that's a problem, if that makes
Okay.
sense. Whereas
Okay.
if you're doing in-clinic work, it's a little easier to have online booking or virtual work, and it's just an hour section. And if we have online booking and that system and flow working nicely, then the client is just going online, booking, you're up and running. And then the admin time, which if you remember, we talked about the intake process of like the telephone call and the emails back and forth and the extra meeting and all
Right.
that kind of stuff,
Right.
that's decreased as well.
Right. Time is money sort of thing, right? If we're spending less time on that, you're paying less for it kind of thing.
That's it. And then really good templates and so on so that you
Right.
can
To save
whip
time.
through those things.
Yeah.
And AI.
Yeah. AI. And it's uh there's certainly some trepidation for some folks around using
Yeah.
AI, and I think a lot of that comes from the confidentiality and the privacy pieces around personal
Everything
health
has to be
information.
de-identified.
Right, right.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
and some of the other things that you were talking about, even in the first episode, Sharie, are around templates and things that don't have any
Hmm.
client-related information, which I think hopefully helps to make there's more of a congruency then and willingness to use it if it's not
Yeah.
related to client-facing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to flip the question and say, you talked about cost savings. What is something worth spending more on?
If you can get yourself, if you can get yourself good people who can give you really good advice and understand where your practice is coming from, that's super helpful. One thing though, and good practice management, good communication tools, and so on. Just those things that keep you from losing time. Like if we didn't have sort of these secure internal communication tools or secure ways of storing client information, you just lose so much time on like just admin and logistics and so on. So getting those things that can help make things efficient and can improve the flow, that's really helpful too. But I guess the other thing I'd say is the right professional for your company isn't necessarily the most expensive one. I mean, the person that we're working with now is the best match we've ever had, and he charges a lot less than one of the worst matches we've ever
Right.
had. So, yeah, I'd say that that's mostly about finding a fit than spending the money.
So we've talked about spending money where, it's going to take your business further, like marketing as an example. And so tell us a little bit about, how you've decided on your marketing strategy, and maybe it is just relying on a third party person. I don't know, just knowing who to market to. Um, Tell us about that
So,
flow.
yeah, so for marketing, it wasn't such a big deal. We didn't really have to think that much about marketing. Like I
Okay.
said before, it was like I was still seeing clients, so it was networking with case managers. I would do in services to people who had questions, and it just kind of did its thing, right? The practice did its thing. However, lost my voice, industry changed. We knew that we had to diversify. So that was when an intentional marketing effort started.
Okay.
And I had a bit of trouble actually getting the people we were working with at the time to kind of understand, first of all, what are the limitations to what we can do for marketing? And that's definitely something that you need to look at with the standards for CODO and CRPO, because we
Yes.
can't have client testimonials. And every marketing company is going to be like, do you client testimonials?
Yep.
We can't.
Right.
Some other colleges can, we can't.
Correct.
You have to be careful of what you say. You also want to think about, especially if you're working in mental health, do you want to enable comments on your social media? And what kind of advice do you want to give? Because there is the possibility that if you enable comments and somebody posts a cry for help and you don't respond in a timely way, could that be a liability for you,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? And then the other problem is, what are you posting and how informative is that information? And could it be used by the client in a way that could cause further harm? So sometimes we really want to promote our specialties. I'm sorry, we can't use that word. Promote our experiences of
Great
clinical
catch.
practice.
Yes. Yes. Good catch.
That's another one. Every marketing company wants to say your specialties and your
you're an expert in this.
expertise.
Well,
They're
I
like,
can't call
no, we
myself an
can't say
expert.
that.
Yeah.
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 So those are things that you have to consider in marketing. So until your marketing group really understands those issues, because they're working with other companies, they forget. They just do their stuff and they forget that there's stuff that you can't have. So you really do have to kind of keep your eye on that. Also, when you're looking at it, what images you're using. And again, I know everybody's different, but when I'm creating the images, I use Canva if I'm doing that. I try to diversify the populations and so on. So I don't, you want it to represent everybody. So talking to your marketing team about making sure that that happens too, if that's important to you. So a lot of those factors are important with marketing. We also, now that we've moved to more of a private practice or private client base, and it's more of a psychotherapy focus, some pediatrics and some OT stuff as well, like adult OT, return to work, executive function study skills, those kinds of things. Who in the family is the healthcare coordinator? Right? And that's who you're speaking to.
Right.
Generally speaking, not to be stereotypical or reductive, but generally speaking, it's a mother.
Right.
RH.
Right. Yes, it's fine. Sharie and I are
Right?
the same age. It's okay for her to say that, everybody.
Yes, that's right.
I'm
We've
also
talked
in that
about this
stage of life
before.
where my head is exploding with children.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So it is, so maybe your blogs are directed to that person.
Right. Right.
As opposed to the others.
A different member of the family, as an example.
Yeah. And it all depends too, on your level of comfort. My level of comfort is, if I write a blog, I want it to be psychoeducational and actionable and just helpful. Yeah. So, but I use AI to help me with that. I have the ideas, I review it, I add a whole bunch of stuff, but I work better when I have a bit of a structure. So I will just go into GPT and say, give me ideas. This is what I want to write about. And then you take it and then you update and you rewrite and you add stuff based on your own clinical experience. And then you got a blog in way less time.
So we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm optimistic that as we engage with and have more guests on our podcast who've been kind enough to want to share their journeys, I think we'll probably get at more wonderful bits of information and advice from you, Sharie, along that journey throughout our episodes. But just as we're wrapping up, I have two things left. One is, do you have any other resources that you would share with our listeners?
So there are a couple additional books that I found helpful. I mentioned The Psychology of Money and Profit First. Psychology of Money was just meaningful to me. Profit First was just a really simple, nice way of looking at your finances. There were a couple others that were really helpful to me. One was Built to Last. This is a book that just really, I looked at, and again, this is coming from my, negative money and business mindset, right? So Built to Last was just yes, evolving. But it really presented business under an ethical framework, which was really helpful. This is Marketing did the same thing. This is Marketing was a book that it put marketing less in terms of like smarmy pushing to get your cash, and more as, how can I provide this service to you? Which that meant a lot to me because I was able to reframe that. And then there was another book that really spoke to me called Blue Ocean Strategy. And I think the biggest theme of that, it was really helpful, but the biggest theme was, you don't So you are two companies that have similar services, and here everyone is flooding the market, just trying to go head to head and
Mm.
competing with each other. But what about those like little gaps and corners in the market in between what everyone else is offering? And that's the idea kind of behind Blue Ocean strategy is it's about sort of tweaking to provide the services that sit in the gaps. So I found like those books were really helpful. And then of course meeting with working with our business consultant was wonderful. John Newenberg. I know he's he has experience working with therapy practices,
Mm.
and but he has a ton of business experience. Like his professional experience is all in business, and he was able to give us a whole bunch of information that at the point that my brain and life were in a position where we could begin to apply it, it really flowed nicely. So that was really helpful to me too. We've worked with a bunch of business consultants and a lot of them have not been
Yes,
helpful.
fair. And you've got to
But
get through
this
those to
was,
get
yeah,
to the
this
right
was
one.
the right
Yeah.
one at the right place in
Yeah.
the right time.
Oh,
Yeah,
great.
he
And
was
we'll
great.
list, for our listeners, we'll list all of these awesome resources that you're sharing kind of in our description.
Yes.
And we want to hear from our listeners. So if there's anything you heard in any of our episodes, frankly, that you'd like Sharie in this case to delve more deeply into, just let us know. And we're happy to have Sharie back as another guest to share more information as we continue to go on this journey. So my
Yeah.
last question for you today is, how would you do things differently?
I would pay attention at the beginning. I would, I mean, there was some impulsivity is not the right word, but there was some going with the flow that I think worked. But there was too much going with the flow. I think I should have, I think that would have shaped itself if I had just stopped and slowed down and actually looked instead of avoiding the stuff that I didn't really like and avoiding the stuff that I thought was not, I'm not going to say not ethical, but the stuff that was too businessy and too money minded, I
Mm-hmm.
avoided that. So I
Mm-hmm.
avoided looking at it because I thought, no, 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 that's not good. That's not being a real therapist. If you're worrying about that kind of stuff, that's not doing it. So I didn't look at that stuff.
Mm.
And it was fine. There were no problems until it wasn't.
Until there were
So
problems.
yeah,
Yeah.
but even just by looking, like it's like CBT, right? You pay attention and you track and you learn from what you review.
Right.
So I think there was a piece of that I should have been doing because all of my changes, all the restructuring would have automatically happened if I had been looking. So
Right.
just don't avoid, no ostriching, even if you don't want to
Yeah.
look.
Even if it's
Now,
not comfortable. Yeah.
that's it. And I
Yeah.
actually had an episode. I'm sorry, I'm going to digress. It'll be a short digression, and then I'm going to come back to my like mantra for the year. But this summer, I was going through our numbers. I was looking at our billables and I was looking at what the therapists are doing. And I was like, how can this be happening for about 3 weeks? I was like, we've made so many efforts, we've made so many changes. And how are we where we were 2 years ago? And it was very stressful a couple of
Yeah.
weeks. And I kept on going back to it. I was like, what is happening? And then when I looked more closely, I realized I had the date set to 2 years ago on my number tracking.
Oh my gosh.
So we're not so bad after all.
Okay. Well, that's like a phew.
Yes. I was like, so pay attention and look, but make sure you have the right date.
Okay.
Um,
Pay attention. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, that's the one thing. I would have paid attention sooner because when you pay attention to all of it, you make changes.
Right.
However, once we did make changes, what I found was patience is so important. Nothing changes in one day. And you just my mantra this year is patience, simplicity, and consistency. Like, you just got to ride it out. Nothing's going to happen in a month. You have to let it look 20 years into the future. Not to say we're all going to be working on our own businesses in 20 years, things change, but just allowing time for things to take hold and work. You start a marketing campaign, it's not going to have an effect tomorrow. So you got to have the patience. And the other thing I'm learning is don't overcomplicate. Go for the simplest solution. Look at the numbers, simplest solution. If you have 10 kinds of therapy that you think are all awesome, but people are only interested in 3, get rid of the other 7 and focus on those 3. Just smaller, more achievable.
Patience.
Do what works.
Patience, simplicity, consistency.
That
Those
is,
are our words to live by, and I can't think of a better note to end this podcast on. Sharie, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure spending this time with you and learning from you and hearing all of the amazing things you have to share. I hope this has been helpful and engaging to our listeners, and I look forward to you and I co-hosting our next episode.
yes, I'm so excited to learn from everybody else. It's going to be fantastic.
We covered a lot of ground in that episode. Check out the description for links to resources that we discussed. Join me and Sharie as my co-host next Tuesday for episode 3. We'll introduce you to OT Shauna Eisen, whose story will be particularly interesting to OTs who are just getting started. Tune in to learn about how she was inspired to take the leap into private practice and where she's at now, 1 year later. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and please share this series with your network.